Is that it? That's it, really. Wow, okay. Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm happy to stand and speak on the first reading of the Housing Corporation Amendment Bill. The reality is this bill was just another piece of tinkering around the edges from a government that has absolutely no plan for dealing with the ongoing housing crisis in New Zealand, and particularly in the instance of Housing Corporation social housing in New Zealand. And I'll say from the outset that Labor will support this bill to select committee. We do so with enormous reservations, and we cannot guarantee we'll support it beyond that. But we actually think it is a timely opportunity to have a discussion about Housing New Zealand and the current direction of Housing New Zealand and their current focus, which has changed dramatically since a change in government. It has been a cultural shift at Housing New Zealand which has been punitive, which has been far more difficult for tenants. In fact, tenants have been completely left out of the loop. And all the reports that the Minister has commissioned, including the huge Housing Shareholders Advisory Group report, which was about state housing, what was one group of people that had absolutely no involvement in that report whatsoever? The tenants of Housing New Zealand. The tenants, who the entire piece of research was about, were not consulted, were not involved, and as far as I know, have still not been talked to about the implications of that report for them as clients of Housing New Zealand. And it does concern me to hear the Minister talking about the separation of state housing policy out from other housing policy, because of course housing is a continuum. It goes from the social housing that Housing New Zealand provides all the way through to the affordable housing initiatives brought in by the previous Labor government, some of which have been continued under this government, some of which have been scrapped. But state housing doesn't exist in isolation from the rest of the housing market, and I am very concerned, and maybe I misheard or misinterpreted the Minister's comments. The idea that somehow state housing policies are from policy for housing everywhere else, I believe will be a step backwards. In saying that, I also know that there are some concerns, particularly within the community housing sector, that there's a conflict of interest for Housing New Zealand providing policy advice when they're also a stakeholder. And I think that's an issue that we can discuss at Select Committee, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I want to talk a little bit about the history of state housing in New Zealand, because I think sometimes members of government members forget where this has come from. And this goes back to the Michael Joseph Savage first Labor government, and a very wise decision made back then that taxpayers' money would be used, would be invested to support families, those low-income families who were unable to access appropriate and affordable housing. And generations of New Zealanders, Mr Speaker, generations of them have invested taxpayer money and have done so proudly. As a country, we've been proud of our investment in social housing, proud of the way that we've supported those families who, from time to time and for varying lengths of time, have needed that assistance that has come from the state housing that started under the first Labor government and continues to this day. It has been a very wise investment. It has provided many families with the kind of support they need to raise their families in conditions that are appropriate, including the Prime Minister of this country. Prime Minister of this country grew up in a state house. And he likes to make a big deal of it, but then I have to ask why. Why then did he stop the building of 500 state houses in his own electorate because he said it would be economic vandalism for poor people to have sea views? Economic vandalism. Well, that's not the way New Zealanders believe about state housing. That's not what we believe about state housing. And that's not... that's very, very disappointing from a Prime Minister that has traded on his state house past, but has pulled up the ladder behind him like so many other National Party ministers and National Party members, Mr Speaker. Now, when we went into the 1990s, that was a very turbulent time for state house tenants. Nearly 13,000 state houses were hocked off, mostly to developers under the guise, and we've heard this again now, under the guise of letting state house tenants own their own homes. Well, there's a reason state house tenants are in state houses, and that's because they are low income, and that's because they are unlikely to be able to purchase their own homes. They can't afford it, and I note that the policy that the Minister brought in, again, to allow state house tenants to purchase their own homes, although this time he didn't make the mistake of subsidising them for his mates, he put them out at market values, has been an abysmal failure. But it has raised the expectations and the hopes of thousands of state house families who thought that this was going to be their pathway into home ownership. And they were devastated when they realised that it was nothing more than a slogan, and that in fact the government wasn't going to do anything to help them into home ownership and to improve the affordability of home ownership. They brought in market rents. They got rid of income-related rents and brought in market rents. It drove thousands of families into poverty overnight. They carried out no modernisation whatsoever throughout that time in the state housing stock. And I want to read a comment from the Housing Minister at the time, Tony Ryle, still on the front bench of the National Party. This is what he said in the general debate in the mid-90s. Quote, "I think it is much better that the state is not involved in housing and that we say to New Zealanders that our effort will go into putting people into private enterprise housing." Close quote. He then said in 1999, quote, "National MPs inherently don't have a desire to expand the level of state housing in New Zealand. It's not an issue that's dear to our core constituency." Close quote. Well, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And nothing has changed between that national government largely and this national government. Those core values are still there. Those core values are still there. And where have we seen this, Mr Speaker? We've seen this in the fact that the State House budget was slashed by 80% last year. Slashed. Mr Heatley has had to swallow the dead rat of income-related rents, as has his party, because they were so unpopular when they were abolished in the 1990s. But they didn't do it because they agreed with it. They did it because they knew that it was politically untenable to go forward with a policy of getting rid of income-related rents once again. So it took a Labour government in the 2000s to bring back income-related rents for State House tenants. We rebuilt 8,000 of those 13,000 state houses that were hopped off during the 1990s, and we did it at a time when there was a major housing boom and it was difficult actually to get builders. We carried out modernisation, again, at a time when it was difficult to get the people to do the work because, once again, in the 1990s, as builders were leaving the country in droves, the National Party did nothing. They did nothing to keep those builders in work, keep them in training. So when we came to another housing boom, we didn't have the skilled labour to be able to do everything we want to do. We had to bring back it. Does this sound familiar? Well, it should, because it's happening right now and it's happening again. And this national government has learned nothing. Nothing. For the last 2.5 years, we could have been building houses. Australia, over the last 3 years, put more than $5 billion into housing as part of an economic stimulus package. They added 20,000 state houses to their state housing stock. 20,000. And you know what? They kept builders in work. They kept builders in work. They kept building companies in employment. They kept local businesses open because of the purchase. They kept income tax, their sales taxes going through. What did we do? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Our building sector is in the deepest recession it's been in since records began. And the Master Builders Chief Executive said, Registered Master Builders Chief Executive said that once again we will not be able to respond to demand whenever we come out of a recession because they won't be there. Our builders are leaving, they're going overseas, our apprentices are going overseas. So what was the government's answer to this housing crisis? Well, they slashed the budget for state housing by more than 80% in last year's budget. And Mr Heatley likes to go around to the housing sector and say to them, times are tough, there's no money. Well, there was a lot of money. There was plenty of money for $15 billion worth of tax cuts, which overwhelmingly went to people who didn't need them and who haven't spent them in the economy. There was plenty of money for the plastic waka up in Auckland. That would have been nice in housing. There was a lot more money for private schools, and $2 billion for a holiday highway north of Auckland. $2 billion, because that's the kind of infrastructure the National Party believes in. Infrastructure that gets ministers to their holiday houses 7 minutes faster. Well, the kind of infrastructure that Labour believes in is housing. Housing is core infrastructure. It should be higher priority for this government. Second thing they want to do is let's hide the problem by bringing in an options and advice service which has no other function other than to keep people off the waiting list, which is what it's doing. Talk to emergency accommodation providers who say these people are turning up, having been turned away from Housing New Zealand or put into boarding houses by Housing New Zealand, living in completely unacceptable situations because the minister won't let those people have a needs assessment before they're farmed out to the private sector. The only reason you would make that decision is to keep people off the waiting list, and congratulations, Minister, it's working. It's working. Hide the figures so that you don't have to deal with them. And then the last thing you do, if you're a national government, is you make it someone else's problem. You say to the community housing sector, it's now your job to build houses, not ours. Well, Labour believes in supporting the community housing sector to grow, but it must be as well as government, as well as Housing New Zealand, not instead of. But instead we have a minister and a government that wants the community housing sector to do their job for them. Well, generations and generations of taxpayers in this country haven't invested in social housing to provide the housing needs for vulnerable families, for this government to hop them off in more asset sales and to treat those tenants as though they should be ashamed to be in a state house.
Sorry to interrupt the member. Her time has expired.